Welcome to the Rulebook Tavern Chronicles, where we are talking about role-playing games. Today, we will be diving deep into the Pathfinder 2e Cleric class, especially since you're looking for a class that's all about support and wielding divine magic. We'll be using the core rulebook as our guide today. I've got our expert here who knows the ins and outs of clerics, so let's get right into it.
What's exciting about clerics is that they're not your typical, stand in the back and heal type. They channel their deity's power, so they're capable of so much more. They can heal, protect, and even deal some serious damage, all depending on how their divine domain manifests.
Okay, so we're talking about divine spellcasters who draw power from a god, right? But it sounds like it's not just about keeping everyone's hit points topped off.
Exactly. Think of them as conduits. Their key attribute is wisdom, and it fuels their spells and all those cool divine abilities. You can almost think of it as a measure of how strong their connection to the divine is.
So does that mean a super wise cleric could theoretically be a better spellcaster than some wizards?
That's a great question. It really depends on the specific spells and how each class utilizes their casting stat. But a high wisdom cleric is definitely going to be a force to be reckoned with in terms of divine magic.
Now, you mentioned domains earlier. How does that tie into their abilities?
Choosing a domain is a huge decision when you're building a cleric. It basically represents your deity's area of influence. So a cleric of a war god might gain offensive spells, while a life goddess's cleric might have amazing healing capabilities.
That makes sense. It's like specializing your divine magic, right?
Yeah.
So we've got these divinely empowered spellcasters who can customize their powers through their domains. What are some other things that make clerics stand out?
Well, they get a deity's favored weapon, allowing them to actually channel divine power into their attacks. They're also surprisingly tough. They're experts in will saves and trained in both fortitude and reflex, making them quite resilient.
Hold on, so they can stand on the front lines and throw at powerful spells.
That's the beauty of the cleric. They're incredibly versatile.
Okay. I'm starting to see why you're so enthusiastic about them. But before I get too carried away, what are some of the downsides? No class is perfect, right?
You're absolutely right. Every class has trade-offs. One thing to be aware of with clerics is that their skill proficiencies are a bit limited starting out. They're only trained in perception initially.
Wait, really? Only perception? That seems like a pretty big oversight for a class that's supposed to be so wise and insightful.
It's a good point. They're definitely not jacks of all trades when it comes to skills. That's why it's so important to carefully choose your ancestry, background, and feats to round out those skills and complement your chosen domain. It's about really leaning into what your cleric excels at.
So you're saying I can't make a super stealthy, trap-disarming cleric right out of the gate?
Well, you could, but it would take some careful planning and feat choices to make it work. They're much better suited to supporting the party in other ways, like with healing, buffing, or even some strategic battlefield control.
Good to know. It sounds like a good challenge for those who like to get creative with character builds. So let's talk about those character building choices a bit more. What are some ancestries that synergize well with the cleric, assuming we're working with the core rulebook options and leaving out dragon blood for now?
Two great options come to mind: dwarves and humans.
Interesting choices. Let's start with dwarves. What makes them a good fit for a cleric?
Dwarves get bonuses to both wisdom and constitution, which is perfect for a cleric. You're boosting both their spellcasting and their durability at the same time. It's a great foundation for a frontline cleric who can take a hit and keep on healing.
It fits the image of that sturdy, dependable dwarf, standing firm against the forces of darkness. But what about humans? They always strike me as a bit more generic, especially for a class that's all about serving a specific deity. How do they stand out?
Humans are interesting because they are so adaptable. They get a free ability boost, which you can put right into wisdom, making them even more potent spellcasters.
So it's like a blank slate that you can tailor to any deity.
Exactly. Plus, there are some really cool feats that can make a human cleric truly shine. The natural ambition feat, for example, lets them choose any skill feat, which can really help with that skill proficiency issue we talked about earlier.
Okay, so you can plug those skill gaps and really specialize your human cleric for your party's needs. That's pretty handy. What about backgrounds? How does that choice impact a cleric?
Well, you can't go wrong with the accolade background. It gives you religion, which fits perfectly with their connection to faith. Plus, you get to choose another skill that meshes with your deity's domain. It really plays into that idea of a dedicated servant of the divine.
Makes sense. They've been training in temples, immersing themselves in their faith. And
Right.
I can see how that would shape their entire personality. But I'm also curious about the field medic background.
Ah, that's a great pick if you
Yeah.
want a cleric with a more rugged, experienced feel. They get medicine and survival, which paints a picture of someone who's used to patching people up in the thick of things. Plus, there's the ward medic feat that lets them treat multiple allies at once.
Yeah.
Super helpful in a tough fight.
So you've got your book-smart acolyte versus your battle-tested field medic. I like those options. They really add a lot of flavor to your cleric's backstory, don't they?
They absolutely do, and that backstory can really inform how you roleplay your cleric and how they interact with the world. But speaking of interacting with the world, let's talk about the real meat of the cleric class. Spells. What are some of the must-have spells that every cleric should consider? I think our listener will really want to hear about that. When it comes to cleric spells, you've got a toolbox full of divine power at your fingertips. It's all about knowing which tools to use for the job.
All right, let's crack open that toolbox. What are some of the essential spells that no self-respecting cleric should leave home without?
Well, we touched on it earlier, but heal is definitely the bread and butter of the cleric spell list. It's a solid single target heal, especially when you need to bring someone back from the brink in the middle of a fight.
It's the classic image, right? The wounded warrior crawling towards their cleric, begging for a miracle. But what about those situations where it's not quite a life or death scenario? Are there any lower-level spells that can save those precious higher-level spell slots for when you really need them?
Absolutely. Don't underestimate the power of a well-placed soothe. It's only a first-level spell, but it heals a decent chunk of hit points, and it can remove a disease or poison condition. Super handy when you're dealing with those nasty enemies who like to inflict status effects.
Oh, that's a great tip. Sometimes it's not just about raw healing, but also about getting rid of those pesky debuffs. What about buffs? Any go-to spells for making your party members feel like divinely empowered heroes?
Bless is a staple for a reason. It's a simple but effective spell that gives your allies a bonus to their attack rolls and saving throws. It might not seem like much, but those little bonuses can really add up over time.
It's like giving your whole party a little divine nudge in the right direction, right? I can see how that would be a game changer in a close fight. Now, you mentioned earlier that domain spells really define a cleric's strengths. Can you give us some examples of how those domain spells play out in a game?
Absolutely. Let's say you choose the protection domain. You gain access to spells like Sanctuary, which can make a target completely immune to most attacks. That's a huge defensive boost, especially if you need to keep a squishy spellcaster alive or protect a wounded ally while they retreat.
Wow, talking about a divine shield. It's like having a personal bodyguard made of pure, holy energy. Now, I know you're always a fan of those spells that might not be on everyone's radar, those hidden gems that can really surprise people. Any favorites in the cleric spell list that you think people should explore?
One spell that I think is often overlooked is Spirit Link. It's a 4th level spell that lets you create a link between yourself and your allies, sharing incoming damage between you.
Wait, hold on. You're voluntarily taking on damage to protect your allies? That seems incredibly risky. Are you sure that's a good idea?
It definitely requires a bit of tactical thinking and trust in your party members, but in the right situation, it can be a game changer. Imagine you've got a heavily wounded ally who's about to go down. By casting Spirit Link, you can essentially split that incoming damage, potentially saving their life. It's a powerful statement of faith and a great way to turn the tide of a desperate battle.
It's like you're putting your own life on the line to embody that divine protection. That's intense. Okay, so we've talked about healing, buffing, and even some seriously strategic defensive spells. But how do you put it all together? How do you actually play a cleric effectively in the heat of the moment?
Well, first and foremost, you've got to think about positioning. You're a valuable asset to your party, especially if you're the primary healer. So you don't want to be the first one to go down. Find those sweet spots where you can stay within range to heal your allies, but also avoid becoming an easy target for the enemy.
It's about finding that balance between being in the thick of things and staying safe enough to keep those heals coming, right?
Exactly. You're like a strategic support unit, always thinking a few steps ahead, and that also applies to your resource management. Clerics have a limited number of spell slots, just like any other spellcaster. You don't want to burn through all your high-level spells in the first encounter, and then be left with nothing but cantrips for the rest of the day.
It's that chess game again. Always thinking ahead, anticipating what challenges might lie around the corner. But sometimes even the best-laid plans go awry, right? What do you do when you're running low on spells and your party is still in trouble?
That's where communication comes in. Don't be afraid to call for help. Let your party know that you're running low on resources and need to play a bit more defensively. Maybe they can focus on crowd control while you conserve your remaining spell slots for emergencies. It's all about teamwork and knowing your limits.
Right, because even the most devout cleric can't perform miracles if they're completely tapped out of divine power. What about coordinating those actions with your party members? How can a cleric best complement their allies' strengths?
Well, it starts with understanding what those strengths are. Talk to your fellow players, learn about their characters' abilities, and see where your spells and abilities can fill in the gaps or enhance what they're already good at. Let's say you've got a rogue in the party who specializes in sneak attacks. Maybe you cast a spell that creates a distraction or provides cover, giving them the perfect opportunity to strike.
Ooh, I love that. It's like you're using your divine power to set up those epic cinematic moments.
Exactly, and it goes beyond just combat tactics. Think about how your cleric's personality and backstory can influence their actions. Are they a stern, unwavering defender of their faith? Or a more compassionate, merciful healer? Do they preach fire and brimstone? Or do they lead by example?
So it's not just about what spells you cast, but also about how you embody that divine connection in everything you do.
Exactly. It's those little details that really bring a cleric to life and make them a memorable character. Think about how they interact with NPCs, how they react to different situations, and how their faith informs their decisions.
Right, it's like you're playing a champion of a god, not just a collection of spells and abilities. That adds a whole other layer of depth to the role-playing experience. Now, I know we've been focusing on the core rulebook for this deep dive, but I'm curious, have you seen any particularly awesome or unusual cleric builds in your games?
Yeah.
Anything that really pushed the boundaries of what this class can do?
Well, there was this one player who created a cleric of a trickster god. They were all about illusions and misdirection, using their divine magic to sow chaos and confusion among their enemies. It was so much fun to watch them play.
That sounds amazing.
Mhm.
It just goes to show that you don't have to play a cleric in a traditional way.
Yeah.
There's so much room for creativity and interpretation.
Absolutely. It's all about thinking outside the box and finding those unique combinations that really make your character stand out. Now, since we're sticking with the core rulebook for today, let's get back to those options. We talked about ancestries and backgrounds. What are your thoughts on how a cleric's choice of deity can influence their role-playing?
It's fascinating how much a deity can influence a cleric's personality and actions in the game. It adds a whole other layer to the role-playing aspect beyond just the mechanics of the class.
You hit the nail on the head. Take a god of war, for example. A cleric devoted to them might be very direct, even confrontational in their approach. They see the world in black and white, good versus evil. Their spells might focus on bolstering allies for direct combat or smiting their foes.
So you could have two clerics with the same domain, say healing, but they could play out completely differently depending on their deity's personality, right?
Precisely. A cleric of a peaceful, nature-loving deity might prioritize diplomacy and de-escalation. They might even try to heal their enemies in some situations. While a war god's cleric is more likely to focus on keeping their allies fighting fit.
So choosing a deity isn't just a forward decision. It can actually impact your entire playstyle. That's a really cool nuance to think about.
It definitely is. And that's one of the things that makes clerics so much fun to play. They're more than just a collection of stats and spells. They're characters with beliefs and motivations that shape their every action.
I'm really getting a sense of how versatile this class can be. We've talked about ancestry, backgrounds, spells, even how their chosen deity can impact their role-playing. Any other tips for someone who's thinking about creating a cleric?
I think the biggest piece of advice I would give is this. Don't be afraid to lean into the role-playing aspect. Embrace the divine connection. Think about your cleric's relationship with their god, their values, their doubts, their hopes. Let those things inform your decisions and shape how you interact with the world.
That's great advice for any role-playing game, really. But it seems especially relevant for a class like the cleric, where faith and divine power are so intertwined.
Exactly. A cleric is more than just a healer or a spellcaster. They are a champion of their deity, a beacon of hope, a symbol of something greater than themselves. Embrace that, and you'll have an amazing time playing this class.
Well said. I think we've given our listener a pretty solid foundation for building their own cleric. From understanding their core abilities to considering the nuances of their chosen deity, we've covered a lot of ground.
And we've only scratched the surface. There are so many possibilities with this class.
Absolutely. I'm feeling inspired to create a cleric myself after this deep dive.
I hope you do. It's a truly rewarding class to play.
Hope you enjoyed this deep dive with us. and see you soon to talk about other classes.